Have you ever been so alone in the woods that the trees felt like a crowd? That quiet you chase on a camping trip? The space where only your breath and the fire exist can turn on you without warning. What happens when you're the only human left out there? I learned it 3 times on 3 different nights, and each time the woods taught me the same lesson in a harder voice. Story 1. The backyard that wasn't safe. When I was 21, I thought I knew those woods. They belonged to my parents, or at least that's how it felt. Back then, the property stretched farther than the eye could see, a tangle of pines and birches that dropped off into a low, mossy ravine. It was private, familiar, the kind of place where childhood's scraped knees and summer fort-making felt safe. I set my tent near a little clearing they'd mowed down, dug a shallow ring for a fire, and stacked the wood. I wanted real quiet. I wanted to sleep under stars instead of passing out to the hum of my apartment. I built a small fire that evening, the kind that spits and then settles into steady orange. I roasted marshmallows until the sugar browned and melted. The flames threw shadows across the trees. The ordinary things felt amplified, the hiss of sap, the way the embers glowed when I poked at them. I remember the warmth on my face and the stupid, simple comfort of that glow, the way a marshmallow at the right moment tastes like nothing else. As dusk folded into night, I heard a voice in the trees. Not a shout, not a clear sentence, a muttering maybe, a man talking to himself. I called out, thinking it might be a neighbor. "Hey, you okay?" But the voice stopped. The leaves went on whispering. I tried to rationalize. Maybe someone on an evening walk, maybe a kid cutting through the property. The rational part of my brain made a list of possibilities, and then, like all lists in the dark, it started to feel fragile. I kept the fire small. I kept the light pointed inward, the tent zipped. Every noise seemed to move closer. At one point something cracked, very deliberate, a single branch under a footstep. I turned my head and saw him, a man stepping out of the trees and into the clearing as if he'd been invited. No pack, no flashlight, just a jacket and an odd, easy smile. He didn't ask to join. He didn't look apologetic. He sat on a log not 6 feet from my fire, as calmly as if this was how nights began. He placed his hands on his knees and watched the flames, like anyone might. But there was a wrongness in the stillness, a flatness in the eyes that felt like someone reading off-stage lines instead of living the scene. Then I heard another sound behind me, something low and far off, like someone crouched in the brush. It was a small, dry scrape, but it told me there was another person within earshot. I remember the little collapse of bravery inside my chest, the 2 of them there alone and me between them in the road.
I asked the man my usual stupid questions, where he was coming from, who he was, and his answers were thin. He said he'd been walking. He said he liked the firelight. When he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. I felt the pulse in my throat. I tried to gauge distance, options. Then I did what surprised even me. I stood up, grabbed my small pack, and ran. Not in a quiet, steady march. I sprinted. The forest closed in, branches whipping my arms, roots catching my heels. Behind me, the crunch of leaves changed pitch, got faster. I could hear the thud of boots, or maybe it was only my own heart, pounding in time. I didn't look back for a while. I couldn't. Every sound wanted me to check. I burst out onto the gravel road near my parents' house with lungs burning and knees raw. Cars don't come down that road at midnight. I stood under a sodium streetlight that hummed so loudly it was another kind of oppressive noise, and I called 911. The operator was calm. They sent officers. My parents came stumbling into the cold in bathrobes, horrified and clumsy. The next morning, the clearing was cleared, the fire pit cold. No sign of them, no tracks breaking the dew. Police walked the perimeter, asked questions, wrote statements. They didn't have answers either. They suggested I avoid camping there for a while. I didn't go back. What had felt like mine, those trees, the pathway, the spots we used to play, felt overnight like neutral territory that someone else could enter without notice. People ask if I reported it because they want a tidy ending. There was no tidy ending. There was only the image of a man sitting by my fire, smiling without warmth, in the memory of that second sound out in the dark. When you come back to what you thought was safe, and it's been violated in a way you can't prove, everything takes on a new edge. If anything like that has happened to you, tell us in the comments. I want to read your story. You're not the only one who knows what that feeling is like. I left that backyard the next day carrying more than a borrowed sleeping bag. I took a small parcel of confidence and set it down at the edge of the town and never returned to claim it. It stayed there in the moss, with the ash and the faint prints no one could follow. Transition, from quiet to watching. After that night, I started noticing patterns. Small things that don't add up until you see them enough times to form a shape. People showing up without a pack. Notes left where they could be seen, waiting just out of the light. In the beginning, you explain. You say they were lost, or they wanted company, or you felt pity. But if it happens again, and then again, those explanations feel thin. The woods make room for unpredictability, and solitude makes you a visible target in a way I hadn't understood. Then came the night, at the fire lookout.
Story 2. The fire lookout that didn't feel alone. I'd signed an online ad for a rented fire lookout that had been built in the 1950s, a narrow cabin on stilts with a wraparound deck and windows on every side. It was the kind of place built to be empty most of the time, meant for someone to watch the horizon for smoke and then go back to town. That isolation is its appeal. I hiked the trail in light packs, each step throwing me farther from signal bars and obligation. The view at the top made the climb worth it. A sweep of ridgelines and a sense of being the only person witnessing the world turn for those few hours. The first night was perfect, in that cold, spare way. A lantern, a small stove, the slow breath of the forest far below. I slept under a thin blanket and woke to the sun trimming the treetops. I felt like I might be the only living creature for miles. It was delicious in a way and terrifying in another. The second evening is where the normal drifted. Late in the day, just as I was settling into a book with the lantern low, I heard steps on the stairs. Someone climbed up, shoes whispering against wood. At the top, a man stopped, outlined in the doorway. He had nothing with him. No backpack, no hat, no torch. He said, almost casually, that he'd been hoping to stay the night and that he thought the lookout belonged to the public. There was a slow, private alarm that ran through my body. He had no explanation for why he'd climbed the steps without gear. He didn't seem surprised to be here. He left after a short, awkward conversation, as if he'd simply decided it wasn't worth making an argument. I told myself he was harmless. People get lost. People make poor decisions. I slept uneasy and tried to chalk it up to overreaction. The next night, I woke to find a small square of paper tucked under a railing board. Written in a little messy hand was one line. Sorry. Somebody had been on the deck, close enough to the rail to slip a note in a place where I would find it. It was not in any friendly or comedic way. There's something unnerving about someone leaving a mood on your porch, as if you'd been touched by a presence and told simply to acknowledge it. That night, after hearing a twig snap beyond the windows, I saw him again. He stood at the bottom of the ladder in the dark, near the tree line, as if he was measuring the distance between himself and the light. He didn't call up. He didn't wave. He simply paused, and then he walked away, not retreating like someone who had been caught, but moving with a patience that felt deliberate. He showed up like a shadow with a plan to see how long it would take before the person on the tower became aware, then made a decision whether to come closer or leave it alone. I thought about staying another night. I weighed the stubbornness of a long drive against a creeping sense that patience can be a strategy on both sides of a porch. In the end, I packed quietly, folding my things and sliding them into a bag with hands that refused to stop shaking. I had a pocket knife in my pack, more a comfort than a tool, and I took it out to feel the weight in my palm. I didn't feel prepared. I felt like I had a thin secret of options, and none of them were neat. I left the lookout in darkness, moving carefully down the trail while keeping my face to the low glow of my headlamp. The hike out was 5 hours long. The forest at night has a way of taking the sound of a single person and turning it into rhythm. Crunch, breath, footfall. I kept a steady pace. When daylight finally seeped into the trees, I felt like I'd left a part of myself on that deck. I told myself many things on that hike. I was lucky, I had read the signs, I left before anything happened. But luck was a river, not a fact. What stays with me more than the note or the man at the ladder is that slow, patient behavior, the waiting, the testing of boundaries. He had no fire, no sleeping bag, no obvious plan that fit into a useful story. He had a presence and an interest, and that's enough sometimes. You start to realize that some of the most dangerous things you share space with are not loud or crude, but small and persistent. They figure out how to make you feel watched, and then decide whether they want to push that feeling further. There are nights I replay that scene and ask myself what would have happened if I had stayed. I don't have an answer beyond the thin knowledge that being alone in a place meant for watching gives you fewer witnesses. That line between being an observer and being observed tightened in my mind. Solitude had shifted from treasure to liability. Transition. The pattern tightens. After the lookout, I began to look for the smaller clues in places I had once trusted. A note left with a careless smile,
a man without a pack, a car that hangs at the edge of a clearing like a question. They are subtle things, but they add up. They taught me another lesson that night. Predatory behavior isn't always sudden or loud. Sometimes it's a slow reconnaissance, a learning of habits. Sometimes it's testing to see what you will tolerate. Story 3. The highway with a black truck. The third time felt like the culmination of everything I'd learned and everything I hadn't. I was driving north on a long, empty highway, the kind of route that runs for miles with nothing but scrub and distant hills. My SUV was half converted into a sleeping place. There was a mattress in the back and curtains I'd rigged for privacy. I couldn't carry a firearm across the border, a regulation that I respected, so the back seat had a blanket and a toolkit and my constant awareness. I pulled off at a small pullout for the night, a rough clearing that looked like others. Flattened grass, a fire ring, the residue of someone else's camp. There were signs of a scrappier stay nearby, a low tarp, a ring of rocks stacked oddly.
That first glance should have been the first warning, but I rationalized. People take what they need on the road. People leave different kinds of marks. I slept intermittently, the car making small mechanical noises that felt huge in the quiet. When I woke at dawn, it felt like the clearing had contracted overnight. There was new trash, more footprints. I shrugged and drove into the nearest town to get gas. That's when I first saw the all-black pickup. It was rusted around the wheel wells, the kind of truck that looked like it swallowed miles and didn't complain. It was doing the slow glide of a vehicle pretending to be casual. Then it followed me. At the gas station it parked across, never far enough for me to feel safe. I put a little extra distance between our cars when I left. It followed me back onto the highway and stayed behind for some time like a second shadow. Not aggressive, not close enough to force an incident, but close enough that my stomach stayed knotted. I told myself it was coincidence. Maybe he was heading the same way. Maybe he needed to stop in the same towns. That rationalization is a dangerous habit. It lets the mind lay a soft path for patterns to stroll. That night, miles later, I pulled into another quiet spot to sleep. When I woke to a pressure at the glass, my first thought was a branch. Then I saw the face, close enough that breath fogged a small section of the window. A man's nose and mouth pressed against the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking. The presence at the window felt like a hand on my chest. For a second, I was convinced I had slept through an entire drama and woken into its act. I fumbled for the keys. I remember the glass trembling a fraction when something struck the frame, and then the ugly sound of a rock on thin metal. A second figure lurched and the back window shattered, glass raining into the cargo area like bright nails. Someone's hand went inside and tried a door latch from the inside. It didn't work quickly enough. I started the engine. The rest of it is adrenaline in motion. I put it in drive and floored it. The truck was behind me then, and for a terrifying stretch it kept pace. I thought it might try to ram me, or block me, or force me into something worse. I drove faster, hard in my throat, and I don't remember most of the turns. I remember the surreal animal focus of moving as if the only thing I had to do was stay in motion. After a mile or two, the truck finally pulled off. I don't know why it did. Maybe it was a bluff. Maybe someone else called it. Maybe it had its reasons. What mattered was that it let me go, and that my ribs refused to stop shaking for hours. I found the police at the next town. They took a report. They told me all the right things with a tone that tried to make logic fit the irrational. They couldn't tell me why someone would test a campsite like that. They couldn't give me closure.
I had the window fixed the next day and kept driving. The sound of the glass repair like a bandage I kept adjusting with my tongue. I finished that trip. I checked into motels more often, kept my curtains drawn, and watched the mirror more than I needed to. But I also carried a subtle, persistent change. The fear never left completely. It folded into my travel habits like a permanent pocket. Some nights I slept with the radio on, enough to hear voices. Some nights the sound helped more than the light. Synthesis. The pattern and the cost. 3 different nights, 3 different kinds of breaches. One man sitting by a backyard fire, one man leaving a note on a lookout, 1 or 2 men pressing against a window and breaking glass. Different scenes, same thread. Solitude creates openings. The woods become an audience, and you are suddenly the performance. What happens when you are alone in the woods is not always violence in the movie's sense. It's the small invasions, the disruptions of your assumed safety. It's the psychological abrasion that turns comfort into calculation. The progression across those nights taught me how private space can be probed and probed until someone decides to cross the line. The first time the danger was eerie. The last time it nearly became physical. Between those poles sits a range of behavior that is hard to predict and harder to prove. I say all this not to sell fear, but to describe a truth. The state of being alone can be a vulnerability. That vulnerability doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It means the world has ways of contacting you can't control. People will test boundaries.
Some will be curious. Some will be dangerous. You can't know their motives, only their actions. There are after effects that don't get taped up by a police report. The backyard night left me skittish in places I once called mine. The lookout night made me distrust long silences. The highway night taught me how quickly a calm trip can pivot. Each story left me with a residue. Small habits, little alarms. They've become part of how I travel and how I remember. I still love being outside. I still seek the quiet. But those nights taught me to listen differently, to note the pattern of boots when they are out of place, to read a note left where no one should have been, to trust the thin, early instincts that tell you when the scene has shifted. Instinct is not a weapon, but it is a signal. What I don't want to do is moralize or tell you that solitude is a sin. Solitude has saved me many times. It has also shifted into danger when others decided to make it an opportunity. The truth I came away with is smaller and harsher. Being alone in the woods makes you seen in ways you don't always expect. Sometimes people just pass through. Sometimes they don't. What happens is rarely tidy. Final thoughts. So what happens when you're alone in the woods? You become visible in a way city life rarely allows. You become a stage.
You feel the deep quiet, and sometimes someone else steps into that quiet and moves in a way that will not be explained. The woods take your ordinary confidence and ask you whether you will be moved by small noises, long silences, the patience of someone waiting outside your light. If there is any grace in these stories, it is this: I escaped each time. I lived to tell you about it. That doesn't erase the fear. It doesn't undo the nights my sleep was interrupted forever after. It only gives me a voice to say what I learned, not as instruction, but as an honest record. There are people who watch, who test, who wait. There are small, simple signs you may notice if you look for them. There is no neat moral, only the lived fact of vulnerability and a measure of caution that now lives in me. If this sparked something in you, if you want more stories like these, or if you have your own night in the trees to share, subscribe and check the playlist. These are the kinds of nights that change how you move through quiet places. They teach you what happens when you're alone in the woods, and the lesson is never as small as you think.